Question number 49 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. An unstated assumption made by the authors about clover. An unstated assumption about clover is that the plant does something, okay? This might be hard to answer without looking at the answer choices, honestly, but an unstated assumption is what they assume even though they never directly say it. Is that the plant does not produce pyrethrums? Yes. Let's unpack that. Because what's the experiment testing? The hypothesis is testing whether or not pyrethrum is related to colony collapse disorder. Just look at the title. Titles are great on these science passages. They tell us exactly what we need to know. I feel like you could have almost answered this entire passage from that one quote, from that one title. What's the experiment doing? We are testing one group of honeybees, commercial honeybees, that are offered a number of pyrethrum producing plants as well as typical bee food like clover. So in addition to the clover, we're giving them pyrethrum. And what does pyrethrum do? It is an anti-mite compound that prevents bees from getting the varroa mite, which causes colony collapse or leads to it. While the control, notice line 46. So this is our experiment. We have one that has pyrethrum and clove, while the controls are offered only clover. Only clover. So one of them has pyrethrum and clover, and the other one only has clover. So what's the assumption here? Clover obviously doesn't contain pyrethrum. Because if it did, then why would we be giving the first batch pyrethrum and clover? And why are we then giving the control to see what happens when we don't do anything, when we avoid interfering at all with the mite infestation, just clover? The assumption is the clover does not contain pyrethrum because then we're not testing whether or not pyrethrum has a role in the experiment or not. That was a tricky one. Clover does not produce pyrethrums because we're testing one group with clover and pyrethrum, and we're testing the other one with just pyrethrum, which implies that pyrethrum exists in one but not the other. What about B? An unstated assumption about clover is that the plants are members of the chrysanthemum genus. That's not true. Because if they were, then what is this experiment telling us? We're going to give one group pyrethrum and the other one pyrethrum, and we're going to see the difference between the two? No. We're testing whether or not pyrethrum has an effect. So we need to have the control that doesn't have pyrethrum in it, and one that does. And that's exactly why clover can be assumed does not have pyrethrum. We can't assume that they're members of chrysanthemum because they don't contain pyrethrum. That's the assumption. So A and B are logical opposites of one another. An unstated assumption made by the authors of clover is that the plants are usually located near wild-type honeybee colonies. Do we know that? We don't know whether or not honeybees, wild honeybees are located near pyrethrum producing plants, or rather clover, excuse me, I'm getting confused. The answer we have to answer is clover are usually located near wild-type honey colonies. If anything, you might argue that maybe they're not, because maybe if normal wild honeybees don't feed on pyrethrum, if they don't feed on clover, then it's not going to be close by. An unstated assumption made by the author about clover is that the plants are usually located near wild-type honey colonies. There's no reason to believe that. There's no reason to believe that clover is by wild honeybee colonies. I don't remember that ever being the case. What about D? An unstated assumption is about clover, direct clover, is that the plants will not be a good food source for honeybees in the control colonies. We don't know. Clover will not be a good food source. Don't they say that a typical bee food source is clover? So we just want to see if clover only is a problem, because isn't the problem with this, we suspect, line 19, that bees of commercial bee colonies which are fed monocrops like clover are nutritionally deficient. But what do bees do? Bees self-regulate. Bees, in a way, they go for a little bit of pyrethrum. They go for then the clover. They go for their food. They regulate their own immune system in order to know what's healthy and what's not. But if they're just being fed in some colony in a farm, clover only, that's when they get sick. That's what this piece is all about. So is it an assumption that clover will not be a good food source? It might be a fantastic food source, but it's like saying oh, spinach is a fantastic food source, but if you only eat spinach, you're probably going to get sick. For humans, that's what it's saying. It's not a good food source. It might not be a good food source all by itself, but it might need to have a bunch of other things, which is what they're testing, pyrethrum and all these other compounds. So I don't think that they say clover is not a good food source. It might be a great food source. They're just saying that it's not good by itself. I think the most direct answer to this question is going to be A. The unstated assumption is that clover does not produce pyrethrums because that's how the experiment is set up. One group has pyrethrum and clover, the other one, the control, only has clover. The assumption can be made the control group does not contain any pyrethrums. That's how we're going to be comparing it against the ones that do. The answer number 49 is going to be A.